The first is government to government. The second is military to military. And then the third is people to people. And I would say the strength of the relationships between Israel and these countries has really been in that order. We've seen about 25 agreements signed between Israel and the UAE, a little more than a dozen signed between Israel and Bahrain, and a little bit more than a dozen signed between Israel and Morocco. And those agreements have been far-reaching in nature. They include everything from agreements on issues like flights between the two countries, exchanges of ambassadors. We've seen Israel open an embassy in each of the three countries. All three have opened missions in Israel. And agreements that really focus on those government issues and then open space for cooperation across sectors. The second space is in the defense realm. We've seen Israel and Bahrain and Israel and Morocco have both signed memorandums of understanding on defense issues that will allow for defense cooperation. Now, some of this cooperation had already been happening previously, kind of under the radar, but this has really brought it to the forefront. And this is the first time we've seen agreements of these kinds reached. And then the third layer is really what's happening at the people-to-people level. And there's been a lot of really dynamic engagement happening between these countries. NGOs springing up, looking to focus on issues like education cooperation or agriculture cooperation, technology, and lots of business delegations flying back and forth between the countries, looking to capitalize on these new agreements. So what you're seeing is pretty remarkable, and I would say to a greater depth of what we had seen between Israel and Egypt or Israel and Jordan. These peace agreements have certainly been warmer than anything that's happened in the past. There has been some frustration we hear, especially from the UAE, about regulatory constraints that prevent the full actualization of economic ties, but these are things that we expect will be sorted through in the coming years ahead. So that's kind of category one. And then the second category is Sudan. And Sudan was a little bit of a myth to begin with. Sudan never actually normalized with Israel. They signed what I would consider like a letter of intent, where they said, look, our intention is that we will move towards normalization. But what happened in the process is that Israel actually became very close to the Sudanese government, and including to the military. There's since been quite a bit of transition in Sudan, to put it politely, and most recently a coup that put Israel in a very difficult situation because the US refuses to engage with the military regime and is discouraging Israel from doing so. At the same time, Israel has deep relationships with the military in Sudan, and so has been maintaining some semblance of relations with them. We've seen delegations going back and forth. There have been moments where the US has turned to Israel to play a mediating role, but the domestic dynamics around normalization, which are complicated across Arab countries, are particularly complicated in Sudan. So I would consider that normalization space to be quite tenuous at this point.
And what about the countries in the region who have not normalized, who do not have diplomatic ties with Israel? How has the signing of these accords impacted these other Arab countries?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's normalized normalization. It's sent a message to other Arab countries that if you normalize relations with Israel, there's not going to be a major civil war. Your country is probably not going to melt down. And to the contrary, that there are real opportunities. And the challenge that Israel is faced with right now is, how do you ensure that people, not just governments, see the benefit of these relationships so that these other countries can be incentivized to join the agreement? I think one of the countries that's been most interesting to watch is the Saudi reaction. Saudi Arabia had already been, quietly behind the scenes engaging with the Israelis, much in the way that these other Arab countries had been up until this moment. We see security cooperation, cyber cooperation, for better and for worse on that front. But what was most interesting is that they have allowed for commercial airlines to use Saudi airspace for overflights that have enabled the deepening of the Abraham Accords. And so that's been a particularly interesting thing to watch. My work at the Atlantic Council right now has been very heavily focused on promoting multilateral engagement around normalization. So we bring together ministers from all of the normalized countries to look at areas for cooperation. And one of the things that's been really interesting to us is that, and this is off the record, although I saw that we're recording conversations that we have with the Omanis, with the Saudis, Mauritanians, we hear a lot of interest. And that doesn't mean they're going to normalize tomorrow, but they want to see how things are unfolding and how they might be able to benefit from this new configuration as well.
If you had to put your money on who's sort of sniffing around to maybe jump in next, where would you put it?
This is like, it's a fool's errand to make these bets, but I would say the countries that are most interesting that I'm really watching most closely right now are Mauritania, which was rumored to have been on the precipice of being a part of the Abraham Accords, but unable to really cross the threshold due to some internal issues. Comoros is another one that is really interesting to keep an eye on. Indonesia, we've seen diplomatic meetings that are happening, lots of whisper campaigns happening in Israel around Indonesia, which would be a huge feat for the Israelis, given that they have the largest Muslim population in the region. And the other kind of obviously the crown jewel that the Israelis are most closely watching and most interested in is the Saudis, but I wouldn't be putting my money on that roulette.
Probably wise. Evan, before we shift in a different direction, do you have anything that you want to add to any of the stuff that Carmiel was just talking about?
No, I think that Carmiel hit all of the main points.
Right on. Okay, so let's take it in a little bit of a different direction. Aside from the initial concession of Israel suspending West Bank annexation in exchange for normalization with the UAE, the Abraham Accords have not meaningfully impacted the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Do you believe that the Accords can be leveraged in the interest of furthering a two-state resolution to the conflict? And if so, how?
Well, I think that the answer is theoretically yes, but the word that's doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence is theoretically. And I'll make a shameless plug for the report that Israel Policy Forum put out late last year, which I co-authored with Shira Efron and Michael Koplow, The New Normal, in which we laid out 6 different ways in which potentially normalization with these Arab states could be used to move things along toward a two-state outcome, whether that is linking normalization to benefits for the Palestinians or getting greater involvement of the countries that have previously established ties with Israel, those being Egypt and Jordan, or leveraging the interest that Israel has in greater ties with Saudi Arabia, which Carmiel alluded to earlier. And each of these are worth pursuing. But I think the question that we need to look at more closely is not how these agreements can be leveraged toward a greater progress on a two-state outcome, but whether the countries involved in them are really interested. And unfortunately, I think that the evidence so far is not really positive on that question. The UAE, for example, which you mentioned in your question, did at least get this suspension of annexation. It is a suspension, not a total cancellation. It's suspended for a couple of years, could come back in the future as an issue, but Sudan, Bahrain, and Morocco didn't really ask for anything. And these are countries that were hardly dragged into these agreements. No one forced them to normalize with Israel. And after the Abraham Accords were concluded in the fall of 2020, the UAE and Bahrain reiterated that they support the Arab Peace Initiative, which, for those who are not familiar, was this program sponsored by Saudi Arabia in 2002 that said that the Arab League states would normalize relations with Israel in exchange for a two-state solution. And you have to do some real mental gymnastics, I think, to reconcile the API, the two-state solution for normalization, with the result of the Abraham Accords, which is normalization without a two-state solution. So, you know, I think this is a result of these countries now differentiating their interests and saying that they don't feel as tied down by the Palestinian cause as they may have, say, 20 years ago in the case of the Arab Peace Initiative, or even decades past. By another measure, you could look at UAE aid to UNRWA, the UN Palestinian Refugee Aid Agency, which dropped off right around the time of the Abraham Accords, dropped off very sharply. That's not to say that there is no engagement with these countries and assistance to the Palestinians. You can look at UAE aid that was delivered to Gaza after the Palestinian Authority rejected it in 2020, or recent donation of some of the Russian Sputnik vaccines last month that went to Gaza from the UAE. But overall, it looks like these countries are, now prioritizing their relations with Israel over their engagement with the Palestinian cause. Does that mean that the potential benefits that can be reaped from engagement with the normalizing countries for a two-state outcome should be ignored? I don't think so. I think that they're all worth pursuing. I think that the key here is that the push is going to have to come from the United States. These countries so far have demonstrated that they are not really going to take the initiative on their own to use the normalization agreements to get progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front. Perhaps if there is an ask from the United States, maybe there have to be some kind of American inducements involved. Maybe then you can get something out of it. Whether or not that will work, I don't know, but it's certainly worth investigating.
Well, let's take that over to Carmiel. Carmiel, to what extent has President Biden or Secretary of State Blinken made furthering Arab-Israeli normalization a priority, if at all? And what could they do to keep the momentum going, as Evan is talking about, which seems to be a pretty big requirement to really see some movement here?
So I want to put a pin in your question and actually respond to Evan first, because I want to offer a slightly different perspective. I think Evan has a really strong analysis here, but I just want to add in another piece, which is, I think that while Evan is right in that what's been laid bare is that ultimately self-interest will always trump support for the Palestinians, or frankly, any other issue. And it's not that these countries came into these agreements without demanding concessions. It's that they didn't demand concessions on behalf of the Palestinians. They demanded them on behalf of themselves, and they made very deep and substantive demands. And that will take us back to the question of where things are today, because the administration is not going to be offering up the same types of sweeteners that the Trump administration had been. But the other thing that I think is worth noting, just with respect to the Palestinians, is that these agreements have a constraining effect for all actors. Nobody wants to be embarrassed by this relationship. And so one of the things that we saw was actually, and heard a lot about from the Israeli security establishment, was active engagement from these Arab countries during the last Gaza flare-up, where that happened very shortly after these agreements were reached, and it was really the first test. And it's widely believed that a decision was made by the Israeli security establishment not to continue the Gaza war, if you will, because they didn't want to jeopardize these relationships. And these relationships really do have a constraining factor. Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid cannot be the people who cost Israel peace with the UAE, peace with Morocco, or peace with Bahrain. And so while that doesn't mean they're going to strike a peace agreement with the Palestinians tomorrow, it does mean that they're going to be more cautious in how violent things might get in a next Gaza crisis, in exactly how far they're going to go. So I think that that's something that's just worth watching. In terms of this administration, I really agree with Evan. It's going to run through, the Palestinian issue is really going to continue to run through Washington. This administration, when they came in, viewed the Abraham Accords as something that was really toxic, because frankly, anything that Donald Trump did is toxic. But even a broken clock is right twice a day. And so at some point they decided, all right, peace is probably a good thing. Now we need to think about how to deal with this. So in the beginning, the administration wasn't even using Abraham Accords. They tried to abandon the title to see if they could start calling it normalization. They tried out lots of different names. The Atlantic Council, for example, we talk about the N7 as in the 7 normalized countries. None of the branding really stuck. They ultimately went back to the Abraham Accords. But one of the key challenges for this administration is that they have not designated a single person to lead on this. And so rather than naming a special envoy for normalization, there are lots of folks across the NSC and State Department, including the US ambassador to Israel, who really want to help support these agreements, to nurture them and to expand them, but nobody owns it. And so when there are lots of cooks in the kitchen, it means that no one's really, no one is driving it the way that it had been driven under the Trump administration. But I will say, in every engagement that we have with the State Department, they've been hugely supportive of the Atlantic Council's work on normalization issues. They really are still prioritizing the Palestinian issue, and they're lifting this with all the normalized countries, with Israel, and using this as an opportunity to try to push for engagement with Palestinians and efforts that will help bolster the Palestinians as a result of the accords, not just alongside them.
Thank you, Carmiel. Speaking of some of these other countries who I'm guessing are part of the N7, peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt, previously the only two Arab countries that had full ties with Israel, did not result in greater societal acceptance of Israel in those states or in genuine people-to-people ties. Evan, do you believe that the Abraham Accords represent a genuine shift in how the Arab world at large views the Jewish state, given the autocratic nature of the regimes that have normalized relations with Israel? And how has the discourse changed around the Palestinian issue in countries like the UAE and Morocco, or even in non-Abraham Accord states, if it has at all?
So I think that the Abraham Accords came about in a context not where there's necessarily greater acceptance of Israel, but that these Arab governments and the Israeli government and the United States began to realize that certain shifts towards greater integration of Israel would not produce the cataclysmic outcomes that people had previously predicted. And Carmiel had mentioned this earlier, that recognizing Israel will not now necessarily trigger a civil war in your country. That being said, what polling we have, what reports there are, I think suggest that opinion about Israel in many of the Arab countries remains overwhelmingly negative. I don't want to generalize too much here, so I'll speak specifically about the three normalizers, or four, but leaving aside Sudan for a moment. In Morocco and Bahrain, according to polling that came out from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation shortly after the Abraham Accords were reached, you had still pretty significant majorities saying that they had an unfavorable impression of Israel. In the UAE, it was more split. I think the numbers were something like 46% had a favorable impression of Israel, 43% unfavorable, and then the rest undecided, with all of the caveats about polling in authoritarian states. I also think that despite the fact that these are repressive regimes, they have some sensitivity to public opinion, and specifically the fact that you see a different approach in the UAE as opposed to what has been seen previously in Jordan and Egypt shows that there may be a little more confidence about how the public will receive engagement with Israel that is, if not wholly enthusiastically, at least indifferently. Again, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been any opposition. There were protests in several of these countries during the most recent Gaza conflict. The UAE has had to take to some more draconian measures in countering critics of these agreements. In one case, there was an Emirati writer who is now not allowed to leave the country because they criticized the normalization agreement. So I also hesitate to describe these as kind of open or tolerant regimes here, even if I don't agree. Yeah, I think that the overall idea, though, is that there's a sense that reaching these agreements may not necessarily produce catastrophic results. And I think also, you mentioned Jordan and Egypt in your question, and I'll close by saying this, that those countries have also taken notice and adjusted their approach somewhat modestly, but still made some adjustments nonetheless. And you can look into what has happened in Egypt, Israel, and Jordan-Israel relations since the Abraham Accords have been signed, and see that there are some more closer and public gestures that have taken place since then. High-level meetings, and another example, the opening of direct and public flights between Israel and Egypt, which previously didn't exist. You would have to have charter flights through a very convoluted system. So I think that there is a willingness to take more public steps on the part of the governments, but it doesn't necessarily mean there is an entire groundswell shift in Arab public opinion about Israel, just not that it will produce violent, catastrophic results as maybe had been previously predicted.
Well, that's worth something. Carmiel, do you have anything that you want to add to that or counter before we open it up for questions?
No, I think Evan really hit it. It's, and I didn't mean to be so flippant. If these had been democratic countries in the Arab world, they would not have been able to forge peace agreements with Israel. We've seen pockets of protests throughout Morocco. And it's been interesting to see what the Moroccan government is willing to tolerate in terms of these protests, how much pushback they're willing to stomach. But in some ways that also forces accountability for a country like Morocco, which had in the past been a leading voice on Palestinian issues. And that's really where the discontent lies. It's all focused around the conflict. And so I think because of that, we hear more from the Moroccans than we do from others, although I would note also the Bahrainis. I think the UAE relationship with the Palestinians, and we can go into this if people are interested, is so deeply toxic that they just don't care. But I think with Morocco, there is a responsiveness to public opinion, and that is going to be important for them down the road.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to open it up to questions from the gallery. You can raise your hand, or you can pop something into the chat. I see we have a question now from Adam. Adam, go ahead. If you'd like, you can unmute yourself and ask yourself.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Jonah. And thank you both for making the time. It seems like there's been a recent easing of tensions among kind of the various countries in the region, be it maybe something happening with Turkey and Israel, UAE resuming investments in Turkey as well, and so on. And, this is all in the context of the perception of the US turning their focus elsewhere from the region. I was just wondering what you think the implications of this all is for, Israel's perceived role in the region among all of these other countries and normalization in general. Thanks.
Which one of us is that directed
to? Carmiel, you're unmuted, so you get to take it first.
Great. Look, I think what we're seeing right now is the beginning of a tectonic shift in the region. I mean, let's take a step back and strip out Trump from all of this. The Abraham Accords were transformative. And for those of us who have been watching the region for a long time, I've been working on normalization issues since the early 2000s. Doing everything from bringing, Israeli delegations to the UAE to helping them sort out how they can appear at sporting events. And even then, never in my wildest imagination could I have envisioned this happening. And so what you are looking at is a fundamentally altered region, and one that I believe is going to continue to change and has changed Israel's role. I think that you just can't underestimate what has happened. Add to that US waning involvement in the region. We saw a tumultuous, at best, withdrawal from Afghanistan. The situation in Syria is horrific and continuing to deteriorate. I see no positive resolution to the conflict, although there will be a resolution. And we see US interest and involvement really stepping out, and the region increasingly looking for ways to fend for itself. And so Israel will always seek to defend itself through its own means, but will rely, of course, on US support to do that, as will other countries, but the manifestation of that support is changing. So I think that you really hit it on the head. I think you see these countries engaging one another, looking less to the US and looking more to each other, how to build a more stable and integrated region, working together to counter Iranian intransigence in the region, and to do it with a different equation as to how the US fits in.
Evan, do you have anything you want to jump in with there?
Yeah, I think that broadly speaking, the Abraham Accords have signaled, at least for now, things can change, and I think things very well may change in the grand scheme of things. That the rejectionist approach is kind of the outlier and not the mainstay, and that. For example, the Turkish approach at the beginning of the Arab Spring, kind of casting their fortunes with Muslim Brotherhood and those kinds of groups, has not necessarily panned out. And I think, and part of that strategy was kind of a more rejectionist approach to Israel. And so I think what you see now with Turkish-Israeli rapprochement, which is also going on alongside Turkish-Emirati a rebuilding of relations, is kind of coming around to accepting Israel and some of the status quo actors as more permanent facts in the region. At the same time, and while there are certainly other countries, and Carmiel has spoken to this, that are in the pipeline for normalization, I also think that there's something to be said that some countries may not be in a rush to normalize now, despite the major shift that has taken place. Because one thing that the Abraham Accords signaled to all countries in the Middle East region and also beyond is that certain American administrations, not necessarily this one, would be willing to give pretty generous and unprecedented policy gifts in exchange for normalization with Israel. And there has been a long-standing belief among many of these governments that predates the Trump administration that the road to Washington runs through Israel, and that having better relations with Israel is a way to leverage better ties with the United States. Part of it may be based in fact, part of it is a little bit of a superstitious, kind of weird philo-Semitic belief that American Jews have outsized influence in the US government. But whatever the case, now that some of these countries know, you can get taken off the state sponsors of terrorism list. You can get an F-35 or Reaper drones for making relations with Israel. I would wonder if some may be waiting for the next Republican administration or an administration similar to former President Trump's to then cash in on relations with Israel, even though they now see that it is possible and beneficial for their own interests to forge those relationships.
Thank you for that. I see another hand, Maytal.
Thanks. Yeah. I just wanted to ask actually something that Carmiel said that was really interesting to me about, not necessarily realizing that there can be more autonomy by working together and not necessarily needing the US or not necessarily to be needing to be fractured with the US, but can actually create a coalition themselves. And then I'm thinking about that in contrast with just recently the news came out about Jamal Bowman rescinding his support of the Abraham Accords. And what he cited, I believe, was that it is there's the ability to it's basically just the ability to continue to arm these kinds of war-focused regimes and countries with abysmal human rights records. And I'm just wondering, it's one thing to recognize, it's one thing to celebrate, and indeed I do, these countries recognizing Israel as a sovereign Jewish state, But is there a concern, or do you see the ability of it perhaps going to the other side of like creating this alliance or this coalition that's very much focused on, you know, maybe like war efforts or ethnic supremacy or whatever the case may be?
I think that's a really interesting question and a lot to unpack. So I want to think about how to approach some of the different pieces here. I think from a US strategic interest, there is a value to having self-sufficient or US supported defense alliances in the region to cope with common threats, whether they be manifested through extremism, terrorist threats of all forms, you know, whether we're talking about Hamas, Hezbollah, other Iranian-backed groups. And so there is that benefit, and there is a reason that the US hosts joint security exercises. So I think that you have to bifurcate US values in that sense, where you talk about what are our security and strategic interests, while at the same time continuing to push for US values around the world. And this is really a perpetual challenge for the US government. And we see this play out in some ways in more extreme manifestations in places like China, where we're trying to reconcile our economic interests with our values as a progressive human rights defending country. And so I think one of the things that the Biden administration and Democratic administrations generally are very good at doing is making sure that they come to the table with all of these issues together, so that in the context of bilateral engagements that they have, whether it's with the UAE or frankly with the Israelis, whether they're doing it privately or publicly, they're raising some of these concerns. You know, one of the key issues that you had seen in the Gulf that's actually improved over time, for example, was effectively human slavery and labor laws. And through an ongoing pressure campaign that brought in the broader international community and public ranking systems, you actually saw this start to improve over time. That's not to say they've resolved the issue, but you see how the US is able to walk and chew gum at the same time. But it is certainly challenging. And I think that the issues that you are raising are serious and substantive, but something that the US is going to continue to prioritize in these conversations.
If I could just jump in there, I think that Maytali raised a really salient issue. I think that the far-reaching criticism of the Abraham Accords and the idea that these countries have opened up relations with Israel is a little bit misplaced, just because there are 190 some odd countries in the world. Most of them have relations with one another, and in very few cases, regardless of their human rights records, do we question whether the mere fact that they should have open diplomatic relations, leaving aside what those relationships look like. You know, even you know, you don't see people questioning that Israel has relations with any country ranging from China to Germany to you know, Brazil, whatever it may be. I think that the criticism of the Abraham Accords comes in part because of the concessions that were made by the Trump administration to get these agreements going, which involved a lot of military inducements, and also because these countries had previously made commitments to the Palestinian cause that they essentially went back on. But again, you can question the wisdom behind those commitments to begin with. When the idea of recognition of Israel in exchange for a two-state solution first came about, in its very embryonic stages in the early 1980s, there were a whole lot more countries that didn't recognize Israel. And maybe it was a sound diplomatic strategy to try to play to Israel's relative isolation at a time when India didn't have relations with Israel, China didn't have relations with Israel, the Soviet Union and all of Eastern Europe, I guess except Romania, didn't have relations with Israel. And but these days, you know, almost every country except outside of the Arab and Muslim world has relations with Israel. So just the basic principle that these relationships have been opened up, I really don't lose much sleep over. Putting on my American Jewish community hat, though, I think that going back to the point I was making with the previous question, governments like the ones that Israel has opened up relations with do have an interest and do see an interest in cultivating the American Jewish community to try to get some positive spin in Washington. And we have seen this in decades past, in periods, for example, when Turkey had better relations with Israel, they often would seek to play Israel and the American Jewish community off against the Greek American and Armenian American lobbies, or at least that was what they were intending to do. More recently, Azerbaijan has tried to leverage the fact that it will not persecute people for being Jewish, for other reasons maybe, but not for being Jewish, as a cause for celebration. So, I would caution for an honest appraisal of these countries' internal situations, while not necessarily suggesting that they shouldn't have relations with Israel to begin with.
Thank you both for that in-depth response. If anybody has a final burning question, we could probably sneak one more in here. But if not, which it looks like not, I just want to thank our guests tonight, Evan and Carmiel. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. Thank